Okay. Okay, so hello, and thank you for coming. Let's see here. Okay, so my background. I'm from Seattle. I worked in youth services in group homes and treatment centers and whatnot for a long time, and then I went here and got an MSW in 1991, and then I did a lot of school-based work with youth, school social work. I did a lot of mostly adolescent stuff, drug counseling, mental health, inpatient, outpatient, casework, all kinds of stuff. And then I came back here and got my Ph.D., as she said, studied with David Hawkins up at the Social Development Research Group, kind of did a prevention science focus in my Ph.D. And in 2005, I went to work for Committee for Children. Committee for Children is a Seattle nonprofit. Please raise your hand if you've heard of Committee for Children. Yes, okay. Raise your hand if you've heard of a program called Second Step. All right, just checking. More people know about Second Step than Committee for Children. So Committee for Children is a Seattle nonprofit that was started 30 years ago. Long story short, what the company primarily does is develop and disseminate school-based programs for kids focused on social emotional development, bullying prevention, and some kind of child abuse prevention. We have a program called Second Step, which is a preschool through 8th grade curriculum, classroom curriculum that teachers implement that is the most widely used program of its kind in the country. It's in perhaps 20% of the schools in the United States, and it's been translated and done in a lot of countries all over the world. And we also have some bullying-related programs that I'll talk about later. So as a researcher at a nonprofit that develops programs for schools, I sort of tend to be on the starting end and the finishing end. So I do a lot of the research translation. How does the research inform our programming? What does the research say is likely to be effective? What should we do? What shouldn't we do? What might work? And then at the other side, evaluating interventions, collaborating with outside university researchers to see if what we've got going actually is having the effects that we hope. And so as having worked on a lot of different programs, one of the things that I focused on a lot is bullying prevention. So I know I'm really pretty conversant in the bullying prevention literature and research and whatnot. So why are you interested in this? Why are you here? I've got a couple of different options, and there may be some others. So raise your hand if it has to do with actual work that you do. You want to know about bullying prevention because it's something that you do, okay? Or work that you would like to do. It sounds like most of you are already doing it. Or work that you don't directly do, but perhaps you're going to be supervising or managing or in some way kind of in charge of people doing bullying prevention. Anybody? So a lot of direct service practitioners. We got so few people here. Let's just quickly run through and just in a couple sentences tell me what you do. Okay. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. So we're going to talk about what is bullying, who are the main players, so I wasn't set up to do this. It was my boss, and then at the last minute she's like, oh, I've got something else, can you do this? So I didn't really put most of this together, but it was framed as what can schools do? A lot of you are in school, some of you aren't, but I think it's still, the basic overview should really be helpful. And then because what we do is kind of build as social emotional learning, she framed the talk as how does teaching social emotional competence help with bullying prevention. So I'm going to talk about that, and then a little bit about our research and programs. So I think one of the trickiest and most interesting things about bullying is what the heck is it? And so I've got several slides on that. Here's one from the dictionary. Using superior strength or influence to intimidate someone, typically to force him or her to do what one wants. So in thinking about what is bullying, of course the issue is like what is bullying and what isn't bullying. So I'll just tell you right now that especially for schools, but I think in general, one of the big issues these days is that as the focus on bullying has really increased, a lot of people are going, yeah, but wait a minute, when is it bullying and when isn't it bullying? And now we've got all these things that say we have to do this if it's bullying, but a lot of times it's hard to tell. And I think that I'll just say part of the background of that is that bullying research sort of hatched out of its own, egg. It didn't come from aggression research. So on the one hand, if you think of it from a scientific standpoint, bullying is clearly a form of aggression, but it's not clear how aggression and bullying, like you can't put the research together very well. So it's this odd duck in the kind of psychological sciences. So there's a lot of issues around like, what is it? So here's another one. This is from stopbullying.gov. Unwanted aggressive behavior among school-aged children involves a real or perceived power imbalance. So now this isn't really getting it. So the first one's talking about why. Why are they doing it? Well, they want to force them to do what they want. Okay, maybe that's part of bullying, maybe it isn't. The second one is saying it doesn't matter why. They're saying it's aggressive, it's unwanted, and it's some kind of a power imbalance, real or perceived. Here's just something I threw in because it's not just kids. Workplace bullying, you can take a quick look at that. We haven't dealt with that. It's a big issue, and I can tell you that one of the things that comes up working with schools is a lot of people will say, yeah, but what about bullying among staff? What about principals bullying people? What about district people? What about teachers bullying each other? What about teachers bullying kids? Here's one from an article in the New York Times. Physical or verbal abuse repeated over time with a power imbalance. So they kind of give the bare bones definition, and then they kind of go on to say, oh, well, really, it's one person with more social status lording it over another person over and over to make him miserable. So now they've got more power over and over, and again, this like, why are they doing it? Well, they're saying it's to make someone miserable. Dan Olveus is a Norwegian researcher who really started the whole field of bullying prevention. This is the definition that they use in his program. His program is the most widely used bullying prevention program in the country. It's a middle school focused program. Aggressive behavior that is intentional involves an imbalance of power and usually repeated over time. And then we have a program called Steps to Respect, and this is the definition that we give the kids in our program. And you can see it kind of captures a lot of the same ingredients. It's unfair and one-sided. Someone keeps hurting, fighting, threatening on purpose. So we don't say to the kids, because this is a grade sort of 4th, 5th program, we don't say imbalance of power. We say it's unfair and it's one-sided. So unfair is like, oh, it's wrong. And one-sided is to get away from the thing of like, well, wait, that's not bullying, that's a conflict. Because if two kids are being mean to each other, is that bullying? Well, we're saying it's kind of more of a one-sided thing. Not quite done yet. This is the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is probably the most widely used survey that's given year after year after year to kids to kind of track behaviors and prevalence of problems and whatnot. So this is what they say to the kids. And I think this is a little bit more adolescents rather than grade school kids. So they give specific examples: tease, threaten, spread rumors, hit, shove, hurt, and they say over and over again. And they say, but it's not bullying if it's about the same strength or power, whatever that is, and if it's done in a friendly way, that's not bullying. And then finally, recently, the Centers for Disease Control put together an expert panel. And they labored for, I don't know, a year and a half to come up with like the real definition, because clearly, especially as states are putting legislation in and whatnot, there's a lot of definitional confusion, as you can see. So this is what they came up with, and unfortunately you can see this is what you get when you have a panel of researchers trying to come up with something that really captures it. So it's unwanted, it's aggressive behavior, and they want to rule out siblings, which I don't actually know why that is. And they want to rule out dating partners because there's a lot of politics around whether you can talk about bullying in the context of dating or romantic relationships. And what a lot of people will say is, no, that's actually dating violence, that's actually sexual harassment, that's actually a whole other category of behavior that has laws and that, should be dealt with in a different way. So they wanted to rule that out. And then they say, once again, there's an observed or a perceived power imbalance. They're continuing to say multiple times, but they're like, well, either it happens over and over or it could happen over and over. So now they're kind of hedging their bets, but they still want to say that's important. And then, I don't know why, but they had to then tack on this thing at the end that says it may inflict harm or distress, including all these things. Well, obviously if it may not, so that doesn't really make sense. But this is what they came up with. So the question of what is bullying is actually a little bit tricky. But I mean, clearly across all these definitions, what people tend to say is that, you know, it's aggressive behavior. It can come in a lot of different forms. It's clearly unwanted. And it clearly involves some kind of a power imbalance. So the simple way that I sometimes talk to kids about the power imbalance is that basically, if you can't make it stop, then perhaps it's bullying, right? Because I mean, if somebody's teasing me or doing whatever, and I can like threaten them or I can in some way make them stop, well then clearly we have enough of a kind of an equal power situation. Or I can get back at them and I can like get them just as hard as they're getting me or something, then it's not really bullying. But if someone's picking on or doing something to me and I just can't make it stop, that suggests maybe now it's kind of a bullying situation. So that's kind of one of the shorthand ways that we talk to kids about it. One of the tricky things, what's the next year? Okay, one of the tricky things is that bullying can come in a lot of different forms. So sometimes, something I've done a few times is, let's see, this would be upper elementary kids. I've done this a few times where I go and I do an exercise called draw a bully. So I say, get out a piece of paper, draw a picture of a bully. So what do you think the most common thing is that kids draw?
Big guy.
Big guy? What else? What kind of what's the scenario? What's happening? What's the bully doing? Any ideas?
Kicking a little kid on the ground.
Give me your lunch money. That's what, I mean, that's not like what everybody does, but like the most common thing that kids will say is they'll have a big thuggy kid going, give me your lunch money. And then if you say to kids, has that ever happened to you or anybody you know? They're like, well, no. So there's a lot of, even with kids, there's a lot of kind of media ideas. The whole issue of measuring bullying is really tricky because one way to do it is that you give kids a definition. This is a common way. You give kids a definition. You say bullying is, and then you use one of these definitions, and then you ask them a bunch of questions. How often have you been bullied? How often have you seen bullying? How often has someone bullied you? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with that is kids don't necessarily memorize the definition and then think really carefully, oh, is this fit? Does this fit? They kind of have an idea about what bullying is and what is it? Who knows? Maybe they think it's a kid asking for somebody's lunch money. The other way to do it is that you just ask about behaviors. But the problem is, if you ask, how often has somebody threatened you and teased you and, you know, excluded you and this and that, well, now you can't really get at power imbalance and you can't necessarily get at repeated. And so now are you measuring aggression or are you measuring bullying? So measuring bullying actually is a really tricky thing to do. So I'm not even going to talk about stats, but we know it's really common. I think that the main thing that I would want to say about the whole what is bullying is that I think that the common kind of stereotyped old-fashioned misperception is that bullying is somebody who's being mean on purpose. Why? To make somebody miserable. What was the other one? Was there another one? Yeah, to get them to do what you want. So it's basically, the idea here is that bullying is something that happens because I'm bullying you because of you and how it's going to make you feel and what I want from you. And I think that the mistaken notion there is that it's all about the bully or the person who's bullying, because we try not to label people as bullies, so we try and talk about the behavior. So the person who's doing the bullying, the relationship between them and the victim, because we can say that, the person who's being victimized or whatever, but really what most of the research and what kind of the consensus at this point is that actually most of what bullying really is a social process, and the main target, if you will, or audience, or, you know, people that the bullying is meant for are the people witnessing the bullying, not the person being bullied. So the irony is that in many ways, somebody can be bullying somebody else and they might not really care whether that person is getting their feelings hurt or not, because the point is, am I making other people laugh? Am I making other people scared of me? Am I making other people think I'm cool? When you look at, so if you do nominations among kids and you find out, basically you do a popularity scale. So you say, who do you think is cool, basically, and you do a sociometrics thing, and then you rank people up, and then you measure bullying. What you find is that the highest rate of bullying is actually amongst the kids who are just below the top. And they're mostly bullying each other. Why? Because there's a lot of competition for social standing in that part of the social hierarchy. So I think that one of the things that's really tricky is that we tend to think of bullying as something that mean kids do because it feels good to them to be mean. Whereas it seems like a more accurate and more useful interpretation is that bullying is something that kids do to try and get social status.
How many kids who have been victims of bullying become bullies?
I will get to that. But that's a great question. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. So one of the things that's tricky is that a lot of the research on bullying is out of Scandinavia. The largest body of research now on bullying prevention and bullying is out of Finland. And I think one of the problems is that if you try and apply research on bullying from Finland to the United States, it might not completely map over because Finland is a super homogeneous, very civilized country where I'm going to say that maybe there aren't as many kids that have as much trauma, live in as many violent neighborhoods, et cetera, as we have here. So people in Finland, the researchers in Finland literally say bullying is a social process, it's a social phenomena. Bullying happens it's entirely about social status. I think in the United States, you probably have more kids who are motivated to hurt other people's feelings because they've got stuff going on. And so I think that there's a mix there. But I think what we think about when we think about bullying prevention is primarily the social aspect of it. And that, again, is where it gets tricky, where is it aggression? Is it bullying? I mean, if you're thinking about bullying, in some ways it makes more sense to think of it as a social phenomenon. If you're thinking about aggression, that's a little bit more like, I'm an aggressive person and I'm, going to victimize you, etc. So, who's involved in bullying? 3 groups of people. The kids who get bullied, the kids who do the bullying, and the kids who witness it. So, one of the things that's really interesting is that there's kind of 2 kinds of people kids who are involved in bullying. One is kids who just bully other kids. The other is kids who both bully other kids and themselves get bullied, what are often called bully victims. So in terms of how many kids who get bullied become bullies, I don't know. The problem with that is that to be a bully, you have to have a certain amount of power, right? So if you're getting bullied, it's probably because you don't have much. So then how are you going to turn around and suddenly be powerful enough that you're going to bully other people? What we typically think about kids who are bully victims is that they are kids that are poorly regulated, they don't have a lot of self-control, they're pretty reactive, and they're kind of prone to aggression. And so on the one hand, because they're kind of not very socially skilled and not very cool, not very popular, maybe don't have a ton of friends, they're kind of good targets for victimization. On the other hand, their response might be pretty aggressive, and they themselves might bully or be aggressive to other kids because they don't have good self-regulation, they don't have good social insight, etc. One of the main things that we know about kids who get bullied is that they tend to not have very many friends. So again, if you're going to bully someone, it's safer to bully someone who doesn't have a lot of backup, who doesn't have a lot of social support, either who's physically weaker than you, or who's socially weaker than you, or who's not as funny as you, or who's not as cool as you, whatever it might be. Kids who bully, again, I think that some of them are kids who are kind of just a little out of control, and they're not well self-regulated, and they don't have great social skills. Maybe they're not real tied in with a lot of positive kids, and they kind of like do all kinds of things, including bullying people. But there's a lot of kids who bully who actually are very popular, very socially skilled, do well in school, are well liked by teachers, and are kind of at the top of the school or whatever it is social hierarchy. So it gets a little tricky. And then the problem, well, so then the other group is bystanders. And what we mean by bystanders is anyone who's aware that bullying is going on. So if you think about it as a social phenomena, what I'm saying, what people are saying is that kids typically bully other kids for the effect that it has on the bystanders. So if I'm trying to get social status, if I'm trying to get people to think I'm cool or aggressive or funny or something like that, I don't really care what the victim says, what they think. What I care about is the kids who are watching. So I want to get a laugh. I want people to think I'm, in or whatever. The other thing is that, especially as you get towards adolescence, a lot of what's going on in adolescence is this whole social sorting process about, what's in, what's out, what's cool, what's not. And one of the simplest ways to establish what's cool and who's in is to point out somebody who's not cool and who's out. So if we can all get together around making fun of that other person, then that helps bolster our sense of we're in, we're cool, we're where it's at, because we know we're not like that weird person who has these whatever things going on that we're making fun of. So the bystanders are the majority of kids that are involved in bullying, and the bystanders are the target for most of what we do in terms of bullying prevention interventions. What do we got here? Best bullying prevention programs target multiple levels of the school ecology, which includes policies and procedures at the school level, training staff, and educating students. The evidence on intervention effectiveness for bullying prevention in schools is mixed. For example, that Olveus program that I mentioned, which is the most widely used program in the country, that program, what the research tends to say, and I actually had an interesting conversation with Dan Olveus about this last summer, and he said the same thing, is that program works pretty well in Scandinavia. It works reasonably well in some other European countries. It doesn't actually seem to work very well here. And as to why that is, what I would say briefly in terms of evidence-based practice is that program relies a lot on having teachers just kind of have discussions with their kids. And it just kind of says, okay, now have this discussion about this topic with your kids. And what I would say, what Dan said is that teachers in the US just aren't as skilled and aren't as trained, which we know that's true compared to, say, Finland. But I think another thing is that teachers in the US oftentimes tend to be a different class and a different race than their students. And so their ability to connect with their kids, their ability to just free-form, facilitate a discussion about real things happening in their peer world probably is not as good as some other places where there's a more homogeneous culture and a more kind of compressed class system. That's what I would say. So, however, there is some evidence for bullying prevention program effectiveness in the US. 130, what's our cutoff here? I want to make sure I don't go over. Okay. And feel free to ask questions, raise your hand. I know I'm talking kind of fast. So overall, when they do meta-analyses and they look at the effectiveness of bullying prevention programs, it's yeah, they're kind of working overall. Some programs obviously more than others. I don't know, this is an evidence-based practice workforce. So the sad kind of reality with evidence-based practice, especially in terms of universal interventions that are delivered to populations in schools and whatever, is that when they work, the reality is they don't work super great. What you mostly get is if you can get a statistically significant effect, then you celebrate success. You're not stopping. There are no programs that stop bullying. So when we say prevent bullying, what we mean is make it so there's a little bit less bullying. Maybe even make it so there's a really kind of noticeably less amount of bullying. But nobody is stopping bullying, just like nobody's stopping violence, nobody's stopping drug use. That's kind of the sad reality about this stuff. And that's the hard thing about our field is that, if we do a good job, we're making noticeable differences, but they're not massive. So the other thing about intervention effectiveness for bullying prevention programs is that they work pretty well in elementary school. They work okay in 6th grade. kind of mixed but mostly neutral effects in 7th grade. And by 8th grade, for the most part, what the research says is nothing works, and sometimes they make it worse. Sad to say. So in terms of like the pillars of the things that schools can do, policies and procedures, these are the basics. This is stuff that now most schools are doing because there's been so much press and so much pressure and so much legislation around this that, you know, there's not a lot of schools that haven't paid some attention to bullying. So you have to have rules. What happens if you get caught bullying? What are the consequences, et cetera? You should have a reporting and tracking system because people are supposed to report bullying, and especially nowadays there's a lot of pressure. So if there's an official incident of bullying, there should probably be a system in place, and most schools will have this, where it gets tracked, it gets recorded, it gets documented. One of the things that's happening now in a lot of schools is that there's incentive for them to try to keep bullying incidents under the level of cutoff where they actually have to go through all this, because it's a huge hassle. And so if they can just, if they can, especially the media, but even like, you know, I don't want to have to do all the documentation, so if I can just kind of work this out and like I don't have to actually say, yes, this is bullying, and now I filled out the form and it's got to go to this person and this committee and all talk, you know. So there's kind of perverse effects of all the focus on bullying, but they should have a reporting and tracking system. One of the most effective things that schools can do is simply monitor. And a simple thing that schools can do, and the simple things that you could do at a YMCA or who knows where, is you draw a map of your facility and you have kids just mark on there where does bullying take place. And you can do it different ways. You can, like, I don't know, put a check mark on the safe places, put an X mark on the dangerous places, put a red mark on, you know, somehow or other. What you want kids to do is all sort of report, like, where do they feel safe, where do they feel unsafe, and if there's bullying happening, if there's aggression happening, if there's if there's incidents where stuff is happening that they're not comfortable with their peers, you want to know where it's happening, because then, especially in a school environment or in a YMCA or whatever, what you want to do then is put staff there so that it's a monitored place. And you know, the reality is that when it comes to a lot of kid behaviors, especially with adolescents, these kinds of structural interventions are oftentimes the most powerful thing you can do, because it's so hard to change all of the social and interpersonal and personal dynamics. How about training staff? Well, in our research, one of the things that we find is that there's a big gap, and this was 6 years ago, but one of the things we found is there's a big gap between what students and teachers say about how much bullying is happening in their school. And again, this was like 6 years ago, so the big thing then was cyberbullying. Teachers were like, oh yeah, that never happens, and students were like, oh, there's a lot of that. How serious it is and how much harm it causes, there was actually a pretty significant gap. Kids were like pretty concerned about bullying. Teachers were like, oh no, we got it under control, it's not that bad. So that's one of the things, is just to increase their awareness about like, what is bullying? What does it look like? What are the different forms of bullying? Because if you think that bullying is like, you know, big kids slamming kids into the lockers, then you're not going to notice like some of the relational aggression and some of the exclusion and some of the looks and the teasing and stuff. So that's important. And then, once again, one of the main things that everybody says around bullying is that you got to report it to staff. And if you're going to have kids, like in our program, for example, one of the main things in elementary school that we do is tell kids to report it. If you can't get it to stop somehow, you have to report it. And if someone doesn't do anything, report it to somebody else and keep reporting. But the problem is, what happens when it gets reported? And what a lot of kids will say, especially in middle school, but what a lot of kids will say is that they don't report it because when they do, it actually just makes it worse. So one of the keys here is that you have to have something in place, and I would say this probably applies to YMCAs and other settings too. You have to have something in place where adults are trained to respond appropriately to bullying. So one of the things that often can happen is people treat it like a conflict. And so, you know, I think this is maybe a little less common, but if you have a peer mediation or if you have a conflict mediation program in your school or in your setting and you find that there's a bullying incident, maybe you have those kids go to mediation. Well, in mediation, there's an assumption of like kind of a balance of power, right? You know, let's work it out. Well, in a bullying situation, that's the opposite of what's going on. And so if you put that kid who's getting victimized in there and you're like, okay, shake hands, it's all good now, right? I mean, you're just kind of increasing the victimization. So we don't want to do it like that. And there's a lot of tricky stuff because there is a lot of retribution. And so one of the tricky things in any setting is how much can you do and what can you do to keep reports confidential? Because, you don't necessarily want to say, hey, Michael says that you're doing this, this, and this to him, and now you're in trouble because now Michael's going to get it that much worse. And can you really stop it? Probably not. And then you have to have a reporting system, tell your staff what it is, whatever. How about with kids? Well, what about victims? What about bully proofing? People like to talk about that. Oh, one of my friends, I told him I was working on this, he's like, oh yeah, what you got to do is teach the kids how to, when the bully's teasing them, just cleverly, turn it on them so that they look stupid. Well, if you're that kid who can do that, you're not going to get bullied very many times. But, that's not who clever bullies pick on. And it's the same thing with the whole, punch them in the face and the whole, stand up to them and whatnot. The whole thing here is that generally speaking, a lot of bullies are pretty socially sophisticated, and they pretty quickly can figure out who the safe kids are to pick on. And the reason they're safe is because they can't stand up for themselves. The reason that we talk about the imbalance of power is because they can't make it stop. So you can't really do a whole lot to change that, because that's the dynamic of bullying. Now, kids who have more friends get bullied less. So if you can help kids get more friends and social connections, that helps. The other thing that's really interesting is that how much do we want to prevent or reduce, how much do we want to reduce the actual bullying versus how much do we want to reduce the harm caused by bullying? And I think that, you could easily say, well, the real thing here is the harm caused by bullying, because if there's the same amount of bullying and we can reduce the harm, then that's as good as reducing the amount of bullying maybe, right? So what reduces the harm? Well, we know that a lot of what makes a difference for kids in how they experience and internalize and react to bullying has to do with their attributions and how they think about it. So, for example, if a kid is in a school where his racial group is in the majority and he's getting bullied, he's likely to actually experience more harm than if he's in a school where his racial group is in the minority. Why? If he's in a school where his racial group is in the minority, then it's kind of easy for him to say, oh, I'm just getting picked on because I'm Black, Mexican, Asian, whatever. If he's in a school where there's a ton of kids like him, he can't say that. Now he's got to say, I'm getting picked on because of something about me. And that feels a whole lot worse. There's some really interesting mindset. How many of you know about Carol Dweck and growth mindset? Anybody heard about that? All right, so Carol Dweck, D-W-E-C-K, but even better is David Yeager, Y-E-A-G-E-R. There's a lot of research in social psychology on how a lot of social psychology, and I'll just say this is not my background, but it's what I've been studying a ton lately because it's so fascinating, and it seems to offer some ways to have impacts on kids that are more accessible because a lot of their interventions are really brief, because instead of dramatic skill training and competence building, a lot of it has to do with perspective taking and attitude and beliefs and things like that. So a lot of what social psychology focuses on is how kids perceive and think about things that happen. So what David Yeager did is, well, let me back up. So we got some time. So Carol Dweck, she did a bunch of research on what she called growth versus fixed mindset. And this was mostly in relation to intelligence. Basically, it's, do you think you're either smart or dumb, or do you think that if you work harder, you can do better and learn more? And what she found was that, and they call it kind of implicit theories, because these aren't necessarily things kids are even aware of. But what she found was that kids who have a tendency to think, well, you're either smart or dumb, what happens then is that they're kind of on the lookout for things that are going to show them up as dumb. Because if you're either smart or dumb, you sure want to be smart. And anything that makes you look dumb is going to feel like hell. And you want to now avoid difficult work, and you want to try not to do things that are hard. And there's all these ways in which it plays out. Whereas if you have a growth mindset, which basically says, I believe that, if I work hard, I can get smarter, I can do better, etc., then, challenging situations, you interpret that as like a challenge. And you're like, oh, I guess I'll have to work harder. And they actually now have interventions that they've done for quite a bit of time that are really brief, 2-3 short sessions, where they basically do these little things where like, oh, your brain is made of synapses and neurons and it grows based on experience, and you can get smarter and you can get better at things if you just try, and the thing that really helps is if you work hard at something, then your brain gets stronger. And they give the kids this message, and what they found is it really impacts how they do in school, how hard they try, how well they score, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now people are kind of going beyond this intelligence arena. And what David Yeager did is he looked at what he calls implicit theory of personality. And basically, the idea is the same message, except the message is your personality is really, it comes from your brain. And your brain is malleable. It's always changing based on your experiences, based on what you focus on. And so that turns out to have had a lot of different kind of consequences for kids, because if you think that everybody's personality is a fixed attribute, then when somebody is teasing you, excluding you, being mean to you, you think it's because of who they are. Oh, that person is, that's who they are, and they're not going to change. You also think it's because of who you are. So if you're in school or you're somewhere and you're getting teased, or you can't make any friends, or you're having bad experiences with other kids, if you have a fixed mindset around personality and you think, well, I just either am who I am or I'm not, then you're like, shit, I'm shy, I'm a dork, I'm socially unsuccessful, I guess that's my lot in life, and I'm really depressed now. Whereas if you have more of a growth mindset around personality, you're like, oh, whoops, that didn't work. I guess I'll have to try something new tomorrow. I guess, boy, I clearly need to learn how to make friends, and it's kind of the difference between, well, let's see. So, first of all, he measured this with kids. Like, do you have a growth or a fixed mindset or a theory around personality? And then he did some lab experiments where kids like kind of got mistreated by other kids on the computer or something. And one of the things that he found was that kids who had more of a growth, malleable mindset around personality were much less likely, when they were mistreated, to want to get revenge on the other person. So that was pretty interesting. That clearly applies to bullying. The most interesting study that he did that's kind of related here was with 9th graders, and he did this intervention at the beginning of the year. Same thing, it's like, your personality is malleable, it comes from your brain, so it's based on your experiences, people can change, you can change. Really brief intervention. Surveyed kids at the beginning of the end of the year. Kids who did not get the intervention had a 40% increase in depression from the beginning to the end of the year. 9th grade, super challenging socially in all different kinds of ways, and teenagers are often depressed. Kids who got the intervention, no change at all. So you can easily say 40% reduction in depression from like a 3-session intervention. Why? His theory is that when people experience social exclusion and social difficulties, if they got the intervention that basically said people can change, people's actions are kind of determined by all kinds of things happening in their brain. It's not because of who they are. The same thing is true about me. Then it gives people a really different way to interpret bad social experiences. So again, like I was saying, they don't have to say, oh, I guess it's because I suck and that's it. They kind of maybe feel like they can try to figure out how to make things change. And they don't necessarily have to feel like that person is doing it to them because that's how they are. It's like, well, maybe they're having a bad day, whatever it is. So this is preliminary work. There's like, yeah.
What age group is your work with?
Well, this was 9th graders, that study. So it's still pretty preliminary stuff. One of the things that we tell bystanders, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, one of the things we tell bystanders is that one of the things you can do is if you see somebody get bullied, you can afterwards, outside of the situation, just go up and like give them a little support. Hey, that was really unfair. That person's a jerk. You didn't deserve that. You don't have to be their best friend. You don't have to like say, I'm going to stand up to the bully and whatever. You just give them a little support, because again, the message that a lot of kids are getting when they're getting bullied is, I'm socially isolated, nobody likes me, I've got all these fixed characteristics that are dooming me to a hellish life, and it doesn't take necessarily all that much to be able to go, okay, that sucked, but I've got a life. I've got a couple friends, or, it's probably because, I'm this or that, race, or, well, he just had a bad day. These kinds of interpretations make it a big difference. So even though it's hard for us to reduce the amount of bullying, one of the things that we can do in addition is think about the harm caused by bullying. So the two key things there are, sort of the attribution piece, which is a little hard to get at, but we want to encourage kids to think in terms of, it's not because of who I am, and it's not because I'm just going to be like this forever, but, that person's having a problem, or whatever. And then the other thing is really the social support piece. And if you can help kids get better at making friends and connecting with other kids, they get more social support. So even if it doesn't reduce the bullying they experience, they're going to have more friends, they're going to feel better because they've got someone to go to, and they'll be like, oh God, that guy, and they're like, yeah, I understand, that sucks, it happened to me too. Because kids who get bullied have friends who get bullied, but it's better than not having friends at all. And then the other thing is having kids who are not going to be their friends provide social support. And a lot of times, the message to those kids, oftentimes, who are like more popular kids, because a lot of the kids who get bullied, like, people don't like them because they're hard to like, and people don't want to be their friends. And they don't want to be their friends because they don't like them, and they don't want to be their friends because they're really unpopular, and kids are like trying to be popular and stuff. So the message is, you don't have to be their friend. You can still be supportive. You can still be an ally, if you want to use that term. You can still be a good person, and just let them know that, it wasn't fair, it wasn't okay, it wasn't cool, it wasn't their fault, that guy's a jerk, that girl didn't, whatever. And so I think that that's a part of this that's oftentimes, it's not bullying prevention, but it's definitely getting at that whole issue. Kids who bully. Well, so now what we're kind of saying about bullying is that kids do it because it works. If they like hurting other people, then I guess it works that way. I think that's less common than that it works because it helps them get social status. So why would they stop? Well, I think that there are some kids who don't realize that they're bullying other kids. They're just not very sensitive. They're not very empathic. They just don't really care. They don't really stop to think about it. And there are some kids who, if they could kind of get a better awareness of bullying, which is one of the things that programs typically do, is really try to increase kids' empathy around kids who get bullied, understand how hurtful it is, understand how harmful it is, and understand what bullying is, so that, theoretically some kids who are bullying other kids could go, whoa, wait a minute, I'm being a bully, I better stop doing that. But realistically, the idea is that it's probably working for them, so they're probably not, it's probably hard to get them to stop just by trying to appeal to their conscience or something, because they probably know they're hurting people's feelings. And then the big thing is bystanders. So if you can increase their empathy, if you can help them understand what is bullying, if you can help them understand the harm that it does, if you can help them understand their role. Because a lot of times kids will be standing around, they'll be watching somebody get teased, they'll be laughing because it's funny, or they'll be watching because it's entertaining, and they don't necessarily see that they're actually part of the problem, not part of the solution. So they don't necessarily see that by providing an audience, they're actually making the bullying happen. They don't see that by laughing, they're making it worse. They don't see, they're like, well, I'm not doing it. I'm just like, ha ha, kind of egging the person on. There's all these ways that bystanders can contribute to the problem that kids aren't necessarily aware of. So that's one of the main things that we do with kids around bystanders, is understanding the role that bystanders play in supporting and encouraging the behavior, and also the positive behaviors that they can do instead. And in terms of a hierarchy of difficulty, people often say, well, you have to teach kids to stand up to the bully and intervene. Well, in terms of the hierarchy of difficulty, the first thing is, don't provide an audience. Walk away, don't laugh. Well, first of all, don't encourage it. Walk away, don't provide an audience. Provide support to the kid who got bullied outside of the situation when no one's watching. And then the last thing that is hardest to do and least likely, and that fewest kids can pull off, is intervene directly in the situation and say, hey, that's bullying. You're bullying John, that's mean. Now, the research says when kids directly intervene, it usually stops it. But the thing is, who can intervene in a bullying situation and stand up to the bully without risking themselves? It's a kid who has enough power, whether it's physical or social or whatever it is, to not have to worry that it's going to come back on them. So the majority of kids, they're probably not in a position to do that because it's going to cost them. And again, kids who get bullied, oftentimes other kids don't like them very much. So really, how much are they what kind of social price are they willing to pay to try to like step in and save them? It's good to encourage kids to do it, but again, it's not the most realistic thing. All the other stuff is kind of, and then reporting is the thing that we always say to kids. And part of the problem in middle school is that middle school kids won't report because it's snitching and they don't do it. All right, so social emotional learning, social emotional competence, how does it fit in? Again, I didn't come up with the title of the talk. I didn't make the slides, so I'm going to maybe not hew completely, but empathy. So empathy is really interesting. So this says what? Being able to identify, understand, and respond to how someone is feeling. Anybody hear of mirror neurons? Okay, so mirror neurons are neurons in your brain that people have discovered that apparently basically the function of them is that if you see someone doing or feeling something, there's something in your brain that kind of responds to that. So one of the ideas with empathy is that, if I see, what's your name?
Chanel?
If I see Chanel and I can see that she's really sad. I mean, maybe she's crying, maybe she's just like, someone's been mean to her and she just looks so sad. Like I may just like have an emotional reaction. I'm like, oh God, she's so sad. How do I know she's so sad? Because I feel so sad seeing how sad she is. So that's like the direct emotional empathy, the kind of affective, emotional reaction empathy that people have, and people do have that. Being able to understand, I may see Chanel, I may see her crying, I may kind of see what happened, and I might not feel sad at all. I might I might be in a good mood because of something else, I might be pissed, who knows. But I might easily be able to look at that situation and go, oh, I see, she's feeling sad because, her friend just dissed her and walked away or whatever, right? Now that's kind of more of a perspective-taking type of empathy. So there's basically affective feeling empathy where I'm kind of feeling the feeling, and then there's more of a rational kind of cognitive empathy where I'm kind of putting myself in her shoes and go, wow, I bet if that happened to me, I would feel this way. And look, I can see from the signs that, she's crying and this and that, I'll bet she's sad. So there's two different kinds of empathy or two different parts of empathy. And then the third thing you see that's kind of been thrown in here is that the person responds to how someone is feeling. Well, strictly speaking, that's not empathy, that's compassion, right? So what we want, everybody talks about empathy. I get this all the time. I'm trying to design these programs. Oh, what should we teach kids? Teach them empathy. There's all kinds of people that are like, what kids really need is empathy. Well, what people want is not for kids to have more empathy. What people want is more compassionate action from kids. And it's not necessarily a one-to-one connection. So bystanders, for example, we know that if kids have more empathy, more empathic concern, they're more likely to intervene. However, we also know from studies of empathy that when someone sees someone suffering, it's a little bit like stress. Like there's stress and then there's too much stress, and like some stress is good and too much stress is like bad. Empathy can almost be the same way. Like you can see someone suffering and it makes you feel bad. I'm like, oh my God, that person, oh, I feel bad. Well, now I feel bad, so what am I going to do about that? Well, maybe what I'm going to do is try and comfort them and make them feel better and intervene to make it stop and fight for justice. Or maybe this person who's getting bullied, who I don't even like and who I'm kind of sick of anyway and is super annoying, is getting bullied by people who I think are kind of cool and I don't want to think anything bad about me. So maybe I'm actually kind of pissed that this person is making me feel sad because I don't want to identify with them. So instead, my reaction to my empathy in that situation might be that I'm going to join in because now I feel like I'm part of the people that are doing it. I'm not the victim, and so that makes me feel better. So the problem is that when you feel empathy, you can react in different ways, some positive and some negative. So it's a little complicated just to say give kids more empathy and they'll do all the wonderful things. Victims of bullying and kids who bully. When you say victims of bullying have less empathic awareness, I don't know that it necessarily makes sense to say that if you could increase their empathy, they wouldn't get bullied anymore. I think that, it's a social skill. If you have more empathy, you might be better at making friends. You might not do a bunch of weird stuff that alienates people, and so maybe you kind of get more socially integrated. I think also that we know that a lot of kids who get victimized are the kind of bully victims, and so they themselves may kind of bring some of the bullying on because they're sometimes being aggressive and bullying other kids, which if they had more empathy, maybe they wouldn't do. Kids who bully, sure, it would be great if we could just say, we're going to make the kids who are bullying other kids more empathic so that they'll understand the harm they're doing and they'll feel bad, and so they'll stop doing it. And I think that sometimes that can happen. I think there are nice kids who bully who just don't even really think about it, and they're like, oh God, I'm bullying, I shouldn't do it, okay, now I'm going to stop. But we also know that one of the main forms of bullying is, and this is where the bullying aggression literature kind of overlaps, is relational aggression. So when they study relational aggression, which is basically, it's not necessarily direct, I'm doing things to you to hurt your feelings, I'm actually doing things to harm your social relationships. So maybe I'm gossiping about you, or maybe I'm actually teasing you, but in front of other people in a way that's going to like make people not want to hang out with you. So it's kind of really trying to harm the other person's social relationships, and it's a more clearly socially sophisticated form of aggression and bullying. And what we know is that kids who do that actually have better perspective-taking skills. Because let's face it, I mean, the reality is to be a successful bully, especially kind of a socially aggressive bully who's doing a lot of manipulating social relationships, you have to understand people's relationships. You have to understand what's going to happen. Otherwise, it's going to blow up in your face, and instead of making you cool and more popular, people are going to hate you. So it's not to say that if you teach perspective-taking skills, kids are going to become relationally aggressive bullies, but it's also not necessarily the case that if you teach perspective-taking or even teach empathy to kids that they're going to now just suddenly stop bullying, because it's actually something that's kind of part of the process. Emotion regulation. One of the types of kids who get bullied a lot are reactive, poorly emotionally managed, explosive kids that are, depending on who it is, either fun or effective to bully because you get a big reaction. So if I'm trying to bully someone because I want to have an effect, if I can bully someone who's going to flip out, and this is a common thing. So I bully someone in like a kind of a subtle way, the teacher doesn't even notice, and then the kid just blows it, and then he starts throwing shit or whatever. Who's going to get in trouble? So now everyone sees me do it, everyone sees me set it off, everybody kind of likes the entertainment value of seeing someone blow up, and they get in trouble. So kids who don't have good emotion regulation are definitely vulnerable to bullying because they're very entertaining to bully if you're that kind of mean person. Now, I think there's some research that says that kids who bully other kids are more likely to lack emotion management skills. Again, what I would say is that's probably the subcategory of kids who are bully victims. So they're bullying and they're getting victimized all because, in part, they don't have good self-management skills, and so they're just kind of all over the place. That said, if one of the things that makes kids attractive targets of bullying is that they're likely to fly off the handle, they have poor self-control, if you can help them be able to like keep it together and not react, you're likely to reduce how attractive they are as a bullying target. Social problem solving. So one of the things that we know about aggression is that it has partly to do with social information processing and a hostile attribution bias. And so this is, again, probably your bully victim kids. And so basically, what that means is, you're in the swirl of social interactions and stuff's happening. How do you interpret other people's intentions towards you? A lot of kids have a bias that says, well, other people are out to get me. If your bias is other people are out to get you and you're kind of an aggressive person, you're going to constantly be getting into fights and maybe bullying someone and starting conflicts and whatnot when there actually isn't even really a reason for you to be doing that, because you're assuming that people have hostile intent And so stuff that's kind of ambiguous, a lot of times you're going to escalate it. So again, this is kind of the attractive victims. No, this is kind of the attractive victims who, whose tendency is to kind of be poorly socially skilled, maybe less emotionally regulated. All right, I got to keep moving here. So, children who bully, lack. Yeah, that's social information processing and a hostile attribution bias. So there's a lot of there's research from like 15 years ago that says one of the characteristics of aggressive kids is that they have a social information processing problem, and that problem is hostile attribution bias. They assume kids are out to get them. So then all kinds of situations that probably are like whatever, nothing, nobody really means anything. If you assume people are out to get you, you react in a hostile, aggressive way, and then conflicts arise. Whatever. So, friendship building. We know that kids who don't have friends get bullied more often, and we know that having kids makes it less harmful if you get bullied. So teaching kids, helping kids make connections, make friends, super important. If kids are bullying for social status, is it possible that we can help them figure out, get better at, or even just choose to use less aggressive ways to get social status? Worth a try. That's probably kind of an individual thing. You know, like if you have a kid and he or she is super socially savvy and maybe pretty funny and whatnot, and you're trying to get them to stop bullying, maybe you can point out the fact that, like, you know, look, you don't actually have to do that because you're so damn funny and you're so, you know, good with other kids and whatnot. Just go with your strengths and stop being mean. Who knows? Same thing with bystanders. Again, it's a social status thing. You can't really intervene if you don't have a lot of friends, so helping kids get more social connections could help. Assertiveness. It's a way for kids to be able to stand up for themselves without blowing up. They can just say, stop it, you know, you're hurting my feelings, whatever. And bystanders, you know, you have to be kind of assertive to be able to intervene, and you certainly have to be assertive enough to go to a teacher and go, I want to talk to you about a problem on the playground. Okay, Steps to Respect is the bullying prevention program that Committee for Children developed. It's a 3rd, 4th, 5th grade curriculum. And guess what? It contains school-wide policies, staff training, and student lessons. I'm going to skip this one. It's kind of long. It's old. It's black and white. We did an evaluation study. We had 33 schools randomized to intervention and control. Ultimately, we gathered data from all the staff in those schools, like 1,500 teachers, lunchroom people, playground people, principals, whatever. We had like 3,000 kids that we gathered data from, certain selected classrooms, and we randomized. Half the schools got Steps to Respect, half the schools did it, half the schools didn't. It's the biggest and best randomized, controlled, trial, rigorous evaluation of a bullying prevention program ever done in the United States.
Where?
California. Around a bunch of different places in California. And it worked. We got all kinds of positive outcomes. Now again, not huge. Not like you would walk in and go, oh my God, I can tell this school didn't get it because there's bullying everywhere. Oh my God, look at this school. It got Steps to Respect. Everybody's getting along and it's a peaceful, beautiful place. But we had measurable effects on all of the stuff that we would kind of hope to impact. So the teachers said, kids who got it compared, teachers whose kids got it compared to teachers whose kids didn't, said their kids had better social competence and that there was less physical bullying perpetration. That was the key finding, because that was the one thing where we were able to say less bullying. And it was the teachers who reported it. Now, why physical and why not other kinds of bullying? Because my guess would be, if you're a teacher, you can see physical bullying. You can't see the relationship stuff. You can't see the dirty looks and all that as well. Students said teachers were doing more of the right stuff. Kids were more likely to intervene. Staff were more likely to intervene. There was more positive bystander behaviors going on, walk away, don't laugh, don't support it, etc. And that the general student climate in the school was better. Students did not say there was less bullying, but teachers did. So here's the thing, evidence-based practice people. We did this study of this program, and it was the most effective program evaluation of any bullying prevention program in the country ever. And by the time we finished it, within 2 years, we went in a completely new direction, and we basically created a completely different program, and we've kind of have mothballed that program. We didn't get a whole lot of attention for the study. We don't know why. We didn't get a lot of media. We just didn't get a lot of attention. People didn't seem to really catch it or care. So what we did is we took our core second step program and we did a revision of that program. And when we did, we went through the Steps to Respect program and we pulled out all of the content in the Steps to Respect bullying prevention program that had to do with social emotional competence, and we put it into the new second step program to make sure that was there so that we could then create a bullying prevention unit that was had like 5 student lessons instead of like 20 or something. So now people who do the second step program can do bullying prevention and theoretically get everything that was in the other program if they just do this bullying prevention unit, which has adult online training about reporting and this and that and understanding bullying. It has like 5 student lessons and then online resources that probably nobody uses. So the online training, there's something for principals, something for everybody, and there's 5 lessons, and it's the basic stuff, right? So it's not how to make friends and all that. Now it's just the bullying basics. What are the class rules about bullying? What is bullying? You need to report it. How do you do that? How do you stand up and say no to bullying? And what's your role as a bystander? All right, we'll just do this because it's cute and quick. I think. So this is from one of the lessons. Or it's a
Last week, things were going great between Shauna and me. She even let me be in her best friends club. Now everything has changed. Shauna says I'm not in her club anymore. And at recess, she and her friends stare at me and whisper to one another. I can tell by the looks on their faces that they're not saying nice things about me.
How do you know that Shauna is bullying
You can see
Addie?
the poster in the background.
Because it keeps on happening over and
Oh,
over.
sorry, it's
It
hard to
kept
hear.
happening over and over. Okay. Jayla, what do you think?
Dare.
It's one-sided.
So it's happening over and over. It's one-sided. So the kids have been getting the lesson that says what is bullying, so they kind of know what to look for. And now they're looking at the video and they're like coming up with the right thing. So they're basically identifying it as, yes, it's bullying and we know why. Let's see. I've got one more actually. Well, you have to buy it. Yeah.
To an adult, and so we have report here, and then we have this person, and she's looking. I need to report bullying, so she's reporting bullying to an adult. It's one of our 3 R's, and we learned about those 3 R's. What's the first one?
We create curricula that get used in schools all over the country, and a lot of what we keep learning over and over is that people are super busy, and this is not really their job. They're teachers, and how do we get them to do something that is likely to be effective but on point with what we want to have delivered? So one of the main things that we do is we try and make it as easy and as simple as possible. So one of the things that's kind of nice about this is that you can actually see, like, she didn't spend a couple hours prepping for this lesson. She's got the poster, she's got the script right in her hands.
This person, and she's looking. I need to report bullying, so she's reporting bullying to an adult. It's one of our 3 R's, and we learned about those 3 R's. What's the first one?
Recognize, report, refuse.
All right, so 3 of them: recognize, report, and refuse. Reporting to an adult who cares about you, listens, and will help you, can help you stop bullying. If the first adult that you report to doesn't help, then you go to someone else. And if that person doesn't help, then you go to another person. But you always want to make sure that you are reporting when bullying happens, okay? And adults don't always see bullying when it happens, and so it's important for you to let them know. Let them know that that might be happening to you. Or
And I think that is it. Questions?
What year did
Maybe it came out in like 2008 or 9, I can't remember. Yeah. So it's been a few years now.
I missed the ages.
Yeah, so elementary seems to work. 6th grade, okay. 7th grade doesn't seem to work, but doesn't seem to harm anybody. And 8th grade probably doesn't work, and sometimes it actually makes it worse, is what the overall research is saying. Now, that's not every program, but that's in general. You know, we haven't done those kind of longitudinal studies, so we can't say. I mean, we'd like to think so. But I think the thing about that is that, again, if bullying is a social process, it has a lot more to do with the social milieu than it does to do with any individual kid's skills and whatnot. So a lot of it's going to depend on the social climate in the middle school. And that's affected by a lot of different stuff. Yeah, I don't know anything about that particularly. I mean, you know, like some elementary schools do the like you can't say you can't play thing, right? So like in elementary, in the early grades, I think that they really, it's a lot easier. All this stuff is a lot easier. Like in 2nd grade, you can say like anybody can play in anybody's play group at playground or at recess, but you can't really do that in middle school. So I don't know. There's not any evidence-based stuff I know about that, but I mean, it makes sense. One of the things that's the big puzzle is cyberbullying, as they call it. You know, basically these days, everything that happens in real life or in person is happening online, and so there's this ping pong back and forth. And so, what to do about that? You know, a lot of the media focus has been on that because cyberbullying has the potential to be huge because everybody can see it so fast and all that.
It's relentless. You can't go home to.
Yeah, you can't necessarily. Yeah, you can't get away from it. It doesn't go away. There's things about it. Yeah. Anything else? Well, that's the thing. Like you can't make it go away because you don't. It's never going to happen that we're going to say, hey, especially in middle school, but in general, like everybody's got to be equally popular and everybody's got to be just the same, and like everybody's got to be friends with everybody. So, I think. Yeah, and so I think that the goal really is to reduce the meanness and aggression in that process.
I also think the comments about have other bigger problems.
Well, and again, we know from research that at least in middle school, aggressive boys are more popular. So it works. And in terms of your question at the beginning, the one thing I know of in that regard is that kids who get bullied by their siblings are more likely to go to school and bully other kids.
Yeah. And they leave the siblings out of I mean, that makes sense again because of the normalcy.
Yeah, because they're getting it, they're learning it, it's being modeled.
Yeah.
Yep.
Interesting.
But the good news is, I think that the long scale trajectory of human development is that violence in all of its forms is going down. Even in the last 20 years, youth violence has gone down dramatically. And so I think what I like to think of and what I like to say is that the fact that we're even focusing on bullying now, as opposed to like when I was a kid and it was like sticks and stones may hurt my bones, I think it's a sign of evolution of our culture, evolution of how people are treating each other, and I think it's a really good thing. Now the fact that it's hard to deal with, well, yeah, but that's not to say that it's not going to change over time. I mean, a lot of it has to do with norms. And that's the thing is like we can talk about skills, but a lot of it's norms too. So.
And it's interesting anyway.
Well, yeah, because that's the thing is you can't. It's hard to make them change. That's where the punishment comes in. Basically, that's like the rules and consequences. That you've been doing this, so now here's the consequence. Maybe that'll make them stop. All right.
Thank you.
Go team. Save the kids.